Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Pathfinder. I have been continuously tinkering on the KLR 650 in anticipation of the upcoming riding season. I've been doing a lot of little things here and there. Today is not going to be any exception to that. There are a couple of bigger things coming in, a skid plate. There's going to be some crash bars that we're going to be installing in the upcoming weeks, depending on how quickly they get here. But today I want to do something that's relatively small, but I think it'll make a fairly significant difference to the riding experience. Now, I'm kind of old school. I learned how to ride quite some time ago with a lot of input from some old timers. And I was taught to ride most of the time gripping the tank of the bike with my knees. It helps control the angle of the bike. It helps control your position on the bike. It just adds another level of control. Feet, hands, knees was what I was taught. Now, I don't know if that really corresponds to modern riding doctrine. I see a lot of younger guys riding around doing a spready with their knees out in the breeze. And of course, I put my knees out in the breeze sometimes also when I'm on the highway. It's a hot day. You need some air circulation, whatnot. But at least at one point in time, this technique was taken very seriously. And a lot of bikes, if you look back to the 1960s, 1970s, particularly British bikes and Japanese bikes, which generally followed the British paradigm, had pads on the sides of the tank to help with this. They provide additional grip and also to protect the paint on the sides of your tank. Now, one wonderful thing about the KLR 650, and I know a lot of people have numerous complaints about the KLR 650, but one thing almost nobody will complain about is the fuel capacity of this bike. It's got, I think, the highest fuel capacity of any ADV or dual sport bike, nearly 6.5 gallons. And as a result, you get this really wide tank. If you look at this from above, you'll see just a broad, expansive tank, and you can really get your knees in here quite nicely. The problem is they're just slick paint, however, and so they don't provide much grip. And second of all, particularly on a dual sport bike or an adventure bike, when you're riding, you're going to be catching a lot of road grit. It gets on your pants. You grip the tank with your knees, and within days of owning this bike, I already was starting to get a really pretty significant collection of micro scratches on the side of the tank. And pads or some sort of a protective layer will help mitigate this. Well, actually, they'll eliminate it. So I looked into tank pads. There are a few options. Kawasaki makes rubber pads that go on here, Kawasaki branded OEM pads that you can stick on the sides of your tank. But last I checked, they were running about $109, which is just too much for some sticky rubber pads, in my opinion. There's one fairly prominent aftermarket manufacturer of tank pads, or I think they call them tank grips, called Tech Spec. They make a line of tank pads or grips that they refer to as their Gripster line. Now those, I know they were available for the Gen 1 KLR 650. I know they were available for the Gen 2. Last time I checked, I'm not sure that they were making pads specifically for the Gen 3, but they may in fact be doing that by now. Those are not super cheap. As I recall, they tend to be in the $60 to $80 range, which still seems awfully high to me for rubber pads with some adhesive on the back of them. There are Chinese aftermarket pads, which actually look pretty good. You can get them directly from Alibaba for like $25, or you can buy them through Amazon for $49. They look pretty good. I've seen some good reviews of them. I've seen some not so good reviews of them also. They're supposed to have 3M adhesive on the back, but I know at least one review that I saw showed that the adhesive on the back of these generic Chinese pads was not in fact 3M. It was some sort of black, it looked like tar, asphalt-based adhesive. And the pads went on fine, but then the guy left the bike sitting out in the sun in the summertime, and the pads started to slip, and they left all this black goo all over the side of his tank, so I don't want to take a chance with those. So I haven't done anything up to this point. And then recently I was watching a video that was posted by Rocky Mountain ATV on some other upgrades for the KLR, and they showed that they have a new product, which is, these are actually not pads, they're more like textured decals. They're from Attack Graphics. Attack Graphics makes a whole line of graphic motocross decals for pretty much any motocross bike you can imagine. I think they're exclusively available through Rocky Mountain ATV, and I think they may actually be a sub-brand of Rocky Mountain ATV. I didn't see them for sale anywhere else, and Rocky Mountain ATV has been promoting them. But they make these, which again are basically textured decals. They almost look like a stick-down material I've seen for doing sort of cheap flooring. But it has a nice grip to it. They're not very thick. They're quite thin as opposed to rubber pads, but they should provide a fair amount of grip to keep control of the bike, and they should definitely do a nice job of protecting the paint on the sides of the tank. Now, I think the model number is in here. You do get two halves, obviously, one left, one right. There's the part number. I'll show the packaging. The packaging has the part number on here and a barcode, and it also has a QR code which you can scan that shows installation instructions. Now, the way Rocky Mountain ATV shows to do installation of graphics in general, their video is not specific to these pads, is a little bit different than the way I've always done it. I have one video already up on the channel where I put graphics, old-fashioned Toyota decal across the tailgate of my Tacoma. And I have my own technique for doing this. Well, it's not my own. I got it from somebody else. Now, my technique requires that you really have at least one fairly straight edge on the decal. And we're going to create a hinge using blue painter's tape, which peels off fairly easily. I'm just using regular, this is 3M Sharp Lines blue painter's tape, number 2093. We do have a fairly straight edge right here, and that is going to correspond with this line here when we install the pads. So I think this is going to work pretty well. A lot of times when you're installing motorcycle graphics, you're going to want to use a heat gun because there's a lot of compound contours on various motorcycle panels. This is fairly flat. I don't think we're going to need a heat gun. But the shop is pretty cold, and this stuff is a little bit thicker than standard decal material that you'd normally put on a bike. So I may end up having to use a heat gun. We're not going to go to that right away. And really, to stick this stuff down, there's just a peel-off backing as you would expect on a decal. It's just sort of paper. This seems kind of heavy duty, but this should just peel right off and stick right on. So we're going to go ahead and install one side of this so you can see how I do it, and hopefully it turns out okay. The very first step when you're applying any type of decals to your motorcycle is to make sure the mounting area, that surface, is very, very clean. There are contact cleaners that you can use that are specifically made for this purpose. I'm going to use Windex. Windex is not indicated for use on automotive or motorcycle paint. I would not make a habit of this, but a brief exposure to the paint, just long enough for me to wipe down the area, is going to be just fine. The reason I use Windex is it's an extremely good cleaner. It gets pretty much everything off, and it evaporates without leaving any residue, which is why it's a great glass cleaner. So you could probably use some other type of glass cleaner as well, but you want to make sure that you use something that doesn't leave a residue, because you don't want anything between this adhesive and the paint that might cause the decal to fail at a later point in time. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up, and we'll install one side of the tank graphics and see how it looks. All right, so we've got the contact area on the tank where the decal is going to go nice and clean. We've got our hands nice and clean, just washed and dried. You want to make sure you don't have any oil or grease or silicone or anything else on your hands that might compromise the adhesive that's going to be on the back of this pad. Having said that, do resist the urge to use rubber gloves, because invariably your rubber gloves are going to get stuck to this adhesive and then you're going to have a real mess on your hands. So I've separated the two halves from one another, and as you can see, they're slightly different on either side. They're shaped to fit this area. So the first thing you want to do is kind of figure out, particularly depending on how obsessive compulsive you are, you want to make sure that you get your decal lined up exactly where you want it. Use a piece of blue painter's tape to kind of support it in place. Now, I was going to use this straight edge as a hinge, but I think I've actually decided I'm going to use two pieces of tape, one here and one here, and use those as our hinge. So we're going to use a piece of blue painter's tape here, get this lined up just how we want it. Nice even gap all the way around. Put a single piece of tape here. You don't want to use the green stuff, the really easy to peel off. You want the painter's tape to peel off, but you don't want it to peel off very easily because it does have to hold up while we're in the middle of this process. Now we'll take another piece of blue painter's tape and secure this area. That gap still looks pretty good. All right, voila, we're all done. I don't think the guys at my next group ride will even notice. Just joking. Now take a step back, obviously. Now take a step back and just take a look at it from a little ways away and make sure you like that positioning. And I think that is pretty darn good. So now we'll have a sit down and we'll make sure that this is nice and tight right here, and this is nice and tight right here, and that should keep our decal positioned where we want it. Now we can remove this entirely. Just put it up there for the moment. And we'll let our decal hinge down. And we will begin removing the backing from the decal. All right. Yeah, that's some pretty serious backing there. So the most important thing you want to remember is you're going to always work, well, in the instructions that Tusk put out, you're cutting a strip out of the center of the decal and working your way out. I like to work from one side to the other. One thing you don't want to do is just slap it on because you're going to end up with bubbles. I'm using something the consistency of a credit card. I didn't want to put one of my credit cards on camera, so I'm using this spotted lanternfly information card, and you're going to use that to help work the bubbles out. So now we just hinge this up into place, back to where it was originally, carefully. And we're going to start, as I said, at one end and work our way out. And this is how you end up not having any bubbles in your final installation. And it really is quite easy as long as you work progressively along that line. And that's really all there is to it. Now we'll take this credit card type item to apply broad pressure. Doesn't look like we're going to need a heat gun to do any shaping or anything like that. We can peel off maybe this blue painter's tape. And that's really all there is to it. So let's take a step back and see how this looks from a distance. So as you can see, this is not a particularly daunting project. It's a very straightforward process. Take your time, make sure everything's lined up before you start sticking anything down, and just go through the project methodically. You can follow the process that I use, where you're working from one side to the other, or I guess from the bottom to the top. You can follow the instructions that were provided by Rocky Mountain ATV in that QR code, where they start at the center and work their way out. That would probably work fine as well. Just take your time and it'll turn out great. I think it looks great. I've already mounted the bike and tested it out. I was a little concerned when I first stepped back and looked at the positioning of this. I thought perhaps it should have been a little bit further forward and a little bit higher up. But I mounted the bike and I've tested it in every possible riding position, and I get good contact between this textured surface and my knee in every possible riding position that I would use. It may be a little bit different from you. You're probably ergonomically different than I am, so maybe you want to check that out before you start installing the decals. But these are going to be perfect for me. I think it looks great. I really like this lava orange color, but there is a huge expanse of unbroken paint color on the KLR 650. A couple of weeks ago, we had really unseasonably warm weather on New Year's Day. Somebody from my local ATV group put together a group ride. We had about 35 people. We rode a 70-mile loop, mostly gravel roads. It was a lot of fun, and of course, at the midpoint, we stopped for some water and conversation and things, and my bike was parked next to all of these other bikes, Africa Twins and T7s and Ducatis, as well as other very utilitarian bikes like the KLR 650. And I noticed just how plain this thing looks with nothing but paint on it. Not really into flashy graphics. I like the subdued color scheme of these. But these definitely break up that just very, very orange look of the bike, I think. The color's great. These are advertised as being black and gray. In fact, they're more like a charcoal gray and a lighter gray. And I think they complement the carbon fiber accessories I've got on the bike now from A to Z Composites. I think they go well with that. And I think it just gives the bike a more finished look. And I'm very pleased with it. And one thing I forgot to mention after all the ranting I did about the cost of the Kawasaki tank pads and the other ones, I forgot to mention the price of these. These are $29. I think they were $39 shipped. So they're by far the least expensive option, unless you go with the Wish.com versions that are drop shipped from China. And I really think you'd be just as well off to throw dice against a wall as to order those things. I'm very, very skeptical about them. This appears to be a quality product. It's very cost effective. And never forget, the cheapest thing on a KLR is the rider. So I'm going to go ahead and mount the other graphic on the other side here. You don't need to watch me do that. So until next time, later guys.